just learned through a school assignment that nuclear power was illegal in Australia and that Australia was the only top 20 economy with a ban on nuclear power.
I find the hypocrisy mind-blowing that those on the left are pushing for the digitalisation, they're pushing for the electric cars, they're pushing for mass immigration, but then they're not willing to have the argument on the other side for how we provide that reliable demand in an affordable fashion for this country.
14 of the world's biggest banks and funds recently committed to support the effort globally to triple global nuclear capacity, including Goldman Sachs, Barclays, a lot of the big financial institutions everyone would be aware of.
They're going to miss this whole AI boom. It just blows my mind that we won't even entertain the discussion of nuclear when everyone else is going in that direction, and we're going to miss out on a huge employment opportunity, economy, so many things, because we're just
literally
so
mind-blowing
on nuclear.
You're watching the JJ Podcast.
Will Shackel, founder of Nuclear for Australia, welcome. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Will, I want to start off with your background, that you launched Nuclear for Australia in 2023. You were 16 at the time, which
mind-blowing
is incredibly impressive, because at 16 I certainly was not launching anything like that. Just tell us how it all started.
So I started when I was 16, largely on social media. I just learned through a school assignment that nuclear power was illegal in Australia and that Australia was the only top 20 economy with a ban on nuclear power. And in the context of what we were seeing in Australia with the energy crisis and climate change, I just thought it made no sense that we were excluding this clean energy option from our mix in this country. So I reached out to experts, started posting some stuff on social media, then got a bit of attention since I'm a young person advocating for this pretty random technology. So was interviewed by a Senate committee in Canberra, got some media attention, and then it really picked up from there, where I was suddenly on Q&A debating the energy minister. I went to the Global Climate Conference in Dubai, COP28, where I got to bump and see Emmanuel Macron, the French president, where he called on Australia to lift its nuclear ban. And then ever since then, nuclear's been a big topic of national conversation in this country. So we've been doing everything we can to increase public nuclear literacy and try and get the politicians on board. But it's obviously a very big challenge to do that in a country like ours.
I find it interesting that this all came off the back of a school project. Can I ask, was the project itself trying to skew you to learn more about renewables, or it was an energy project in general, and then you happened to find out about nuclear?
It wasn't even an energy project. It was just looking at big challenges which were going on. And previously I'd had other assignments where I'd looked at nuclear, and obviously we'd been positioned to consider renewables and the role that they have in combating climate change. We're really not told about nuclear in the education system, unfortunately, in Australia. So I stumbled across it myself. I decided to dedicate my commerce assignment in year 10 to it, where I realised it was banned, and then had a Christmas school holidays ahead of me. And at that point, I think most people in their Christmas school holidays my age often looking for things to do. So I decided to go down this path, and then it really just snowballed, I guess.
It's very impressive, Will. Now, you also have a petition online to lift the moratorium. What's the feedback been like? How many signatures do you have on that? Because I know I put my name on the petition.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's up to over 116,000 Australians who've signed our petition to legalise nuclear power, which is, I think, one of probably the biggest petition for or against nuclear power in Australia. So that's a huge amount of people, which has grown from, really nothing. I had no resources to promote the petition or anything when I started it on change.org, and it's now on our website, nuclearforaustralia.com, and it's been really excellent to see it grow and see the real grassroots movement that's behind nuclear power, because so many Australians, I think, realise that, we need to have nuclear power in our mix. So yeah, it's grown a lot since it all began.
Can you speak into, you've already mentioned that Australia is the only G20 country that is not using nuclear. Please fact check us if this is not correct. But as far as we are aware, there's around 31 countries already using nuclear, and perhaps another 50 that are signed on to exploring this as part of their energy future. how do you think we get the message to Australians that nuclear power is the future? I mean, 115,000 signatures is really impressive, and I'm sure this is just the beginning. But we have 27 million people here, and we need millions of people signing on to this.
Oh,
so
exactly.
what do you think is the way forward to get that message to Australians?
So Australia's the only top 20 economy with a ban on nuclear power. And when you look at the countries on that list who don't have nuclear power at the moment, all of them are currently considering nuclear power or have had a previous nuclear industry. You know, a good example is Germany, where they've just shut down their nuclear reactors, and they've even had to acknowledge that that was a huge strategic mistake. There are 31 countries with nuclear power at the moment, around 60 now, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency exploring it, including many in our region. And I think it's important for, to get more Australians on board, to look at these global case studies. All of these countries that people have probably visited, like the United States, UK, France, they get around 65% of their energy in France from nuclear power, a series of around 50 reactors. Around 10% of their energy actually comes from recycled nuclear fuel in France, which probably a lot of people don't know is even possible. So these are countries that most Australians have probably either visited or certainly heard of, which have nuclear power, have had successful industries, and thanks to nuclear power have low emissions, lower power prices, high reliability, and are actually able to keep industry in their country. So I think especially as there's all this global momentum at the moment, hope more Australians are able to see it, our politicians are able to see it, and I think that will just continue to drive the conversation for nuclear power forward.
I'll come to the recycling element in a moment, because that is certainly something that a lot of people are often concerned about. But just while we're speaking about other countries overseas, and I know France were almost that accidental nuclear powerhouse starting in the 80s, but one country that I would love for you to tell our listeners about is Finland, because it was their Greens party were the ones who said, no, if we want zero emissions, we want to protect our environment, nuclear is the way forward. How do we then convince
Our Greens.
Absolutely. And a lot of we all love the environment, and we're all pro making sure that we have a reliable and sustainable environment moving forward. So how do we get that message out that other Greens parties are all pro-nuclear?
Well, the interesting thing is it's not just the Finnish Greens. In Finland, they've got a series of nuclear reactors which contribute around 40% of their energy. They've also got what is the world's first deep geological repository for spent nuclear fuel, ultimate solution for nuclear waste, which is really exciting. So they've got broad consensus in Finland. But this idea that nuclear has to be a politically contentious issue just isn't the same case around the world, whether it's the Finnish Greens supporting nuclear power. In the UK, both the UK Labour Party and the Conservative Party back nuclear power. In fact, Keir Starmer had a major announcement supporting Sizewell C, the nuclear power project there, and small modular reactors with Rolls-Royce SMR. And then even in the US, which probably has the most divided politics that anyone would be able to think of, both the Democrats and Republicans support nuclear power, and that's despite all of their differences on energy. It's the one thing that both of them are able to get behind. The Trump administration's backing it, but also the Biden administration has been really essential in the nuclear renaissance that's underway at the moment in the United States. So this idea that, it's only the conservative side of politics in Australia that can support nuclear power, and that the progressives like our Greens, like our Labor Party, have to oppose it, particularly when these are the parties which should care about, helping the environment with clean energy. And I guess for the Labor Party, helping workers, and there's no better employer for energy workers than nuclear power is seen in other countries. It just makes sense.
Just take us to that.
Yeah, that was going to be the next point.
I've taken this off your website, so I'm going to just assume, never assume, but I am going to assume that the stats are correct, but that on average in the US, it employs on average 9,000 workers during construction and 5 times more permanent on-site jobs in nuclear compared to the renewables. And the one thing that I also was speaking about quite a lot in the election last year was more the conversion of the coal-fired power station. Their jobs, 77% can automatically be transferred to nuclear. Why isn't this ever part of the discussion about the sheer volume of employment? Because this seems quite crucial.
Oh, and it's really important for these regional communities because the interesting thing was in the lead up to the election, a lot of these communities that the coalition identified for nuclear power plants, there's actually a lot of support for nuclear power. Funnily enough, a lot of the seats where the nuclear power plants were actually proposed, none of them changed hands. In fact, some of them had large swings towards the coalition, despite obviously what happened in the election, which everyone is very familiar with. So that indicated that the people in the community supported. And why was that? It was because of the generational opportunities that nuclear provided. We did a lot of information evenings where we brought nuclear experts out as Nuclear for Australia to these communities to talk to them, do presentations, answer their questions. And the thing that kept on coming up is these facts about whether it's transitioning nuclear workers to coal sites, the opportunities with the indirect jobs which come from nuclear power plants. You know, it's even things like all the security guards needed for a nuclear plant. You know, you've got so many workers in a nuclear plant, and they're not all nuclear engineers. Many of them are just, you know, whether it is a security guard, a plumber, an electrician, these are transferable skills. And importantly for Australia, we're doing the work of building these unique nuclear skills thanks to the AUKUS nuclear submarine program. The government is spending millions and millions and millions, probably billions, training, recruiting the workforce, sending them overseas to look at overseas reactors. And we expect that all of these submariners are just going to stay in the submarines their whole lives. When you look around the world, most of the people in the control rooms at nuclear plants, at least the ones I've visited, a lot of them actually come from a history of working in the nuclear-powered submarines, whether in the US, UK. So I think we need to this workforce question is really important. And I think there's a lot of serious questions for a lot of the unions in Australia. Why do they not support nuclear power? They support in the UK, but it just makes complete sense because, nuclear is a fantastic employer compared to the other energy sources.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing that both of you are touching on here is that the debate hasn't happened. The information hasn't been put out there. And I would say the same thing about renewables as what I would nuclear. I think you've already said this isn't a left or a right side of government type situation. I just think the public aren't informed. The true debate has not happened around any of this. You know, we went into the last election where they absolutely decimated the Liberals over this $600 billion nuclear thing. And yet my husband was reading an article today about a $600 billion infrastructure rollout for renewables. And so it's just, but the public haven't been informed and the debate has not taken place. So what's your biggest frustration in terms of misinformation surrounding nuclear?
A lot of frustration because in the lead up to the election, there was around $3 million at least spent on a large digital nuclear disinformation campaign. And it was these lies like nuclear would cost $600 billion, that nuclear would only be, around 4% of the grid, that it would take over 20 years, which experts time after time had to call out. But we just weren't hearing it because of the amount of money being pushed by a lot of these civil societies, these so-called environmental groups, who are meant to stand for the environment, but oppose a source of clean energy in our mix in Australia. And I think that was so disappointing because for us on the nuclear side, we don't have a nuclear industry in Australia. There's a reason that it's taking, a 19-year-old filming videos on social media to be able to do things like this because it requires this grassroots volunteer effort in this country. There is not that same industry funding presence that we have, say, for fossil fuels or renewables in this country. So I think it's important to be aware of. And on the $600 billion figure, 4% as well, the $600 billion, a lot of Australians would know it was taken from the cost of the most expensive nuclear power project ever, Hinkley Point C. Then they doubled it, and then they extrapolated it out. And say for the 4% figure, it just ignored the different reliability of a solar farm versus a nuclear plant. And what I mean there is that, a solar farm might have a capacity factor operating at a reliability around 30% compared to a nuclear plant around 90%. And what that meant is that, nuclear might have this overall capacity in the grid of 4%, but it's doing far more heavy lifting in the grid than the solar farms and the wind farms, which make up the rest of the capacity, because there's that difference between capacity and generation. Now, obviously, as I described that, it's quite a technical argument to make. So it's really difficult to fact check it when it's just being pushed out there all the time. But these are some of the claims that we're facing in Australia at the moment and need to move past.
Well, how much, in your opinion, so for people listening, what is a price that you would throw out there for the construction of a small modular reactor and the time that it's expected to take? So I know that they are often built offshore and then they can almost sort of be shipped here, and construction isn't actually as long as what people think. I've heard around the 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, some people said 30, and then people came on our socials last week and were like, oh, it's more like 6 years. I'm like, okay.
Yes.
The public are arguing about it.
Yeah, I was told around the 5 to 7 years.
Well, on time, the average construction time of nuclear reactors around the world is around 6 to 8 years. So certainly within that time frame, that's possible. Now, for Australia, there would be some initial work required before we have our first civil nuclear power plant in this country. But the great thing is, compared to a lot of nations exploring nuclear at the moment, Australia's not starting from scratch. We've got a research reactor 40 kilometres away from the Sydney CBD producing life-saving nuclear medicines. We've got existing nuclear regulators which are respected around the world. We're building up the nuclear workforce and supply chain with the AUKUS nuclear submarines. So most experts predict it would take between 10 to 15 years for Australia to have its first nuclear plant. Obviously, with small modular reactors, that timeframe could reduce. There's many being built at the moment around the world and have designs underway. And the International Atomic Energy Agency predicts for a nuclear newcomer country like Australia, it would be that 10 to 15 year window. On the cost, there's no going past it that certainly in the West, the capital cost to build a nuclear power plant is high. Generally, you're looking in the billions, and that includes for a small modular reactor. But the benefit needs to be looked at in long term and with a full holistic view of our energy system. And that's not happening at the moment with renewables. A nuclear plant can last, from 60 to
100
80,
years.
to 100 years, a century long compared to, maybe a solar farm, 20, 30 years at best. In addition to that, you don't need the same firming, so you don't need to build all those batteries, the expensive gas plants, the snowy hydros, which are going up in cost. And also, you can build them, you're not limited as much to the geography. So say a wind farm needs to be built where it's windy, there might not be transmission infrastructure there. So with a nuclear plant, you can plop one down where there's those existing power lines. And that's, again, a huge saving because that's one of the big things which are driving up power prices at the moment is these huge transmission infrastructure projects required. So when you look at everything like that holistically, nuclear reduces energy system costs and ultimately power bills. And there's a good example in the US. The United States Department of Energy under Joe Biden found that nuclear in the mix reduced system costs alongside renewables by, I think it was around 30%.
Incredible.
And there's multiple studies of this. And it's why there's so much investment in nuclear power at the moment. I think it was 37% was the specific figure. But you can see it stacks up because all of these countries are currently investing in it. Around 38 countries, I think, that now make up 70% of global GDP have committed to triple global nuclear capacity by 2050. So if it was too expensive, if it did take too long, why are they doing it? What do we know in Australia
that no one else knows? What is it that you're hearing? Like in terms of you being on social media, website, all of the media functions that you do. I know that for Jamie and I, Jamie ran in the seat of Warringah during the federal election last year, and we both had our feet on the ground, door knocking and speaking with locals. And I don't know about Jamie, but for myself, it was a surprise to see that young people are actually quite pro-nuclear. That's, generally speaking. And I think it's because they see the Amazons and the Googles and the AI and where the future's going in terms of the energy capacity that we're going to need. But what is it that you think is holding Australia back? Do you think it's cost, or do you think it's fear of the Simpsons and the three-eyed fish and what we do not understand about nuclear waste and...
Yeah. So we did some polling in October last year after the election, and it found that significantly more Australians actually support nuclear power than oppose it. That's despite the huge fear campaign that took place in the election. I think it was 47% support, 34% oppose, and then the rest, I think 19%, hopefully that all adds up to 100, are undecided. I think the the debate's maturing in Australia, and that's due to a few things. I think that nowadays young people are much more pro-technology. In certain areas in Australia, with whether it's Lucas Heights, whether it's the nuclear submarines, people's openness to nuclear technology is higher, and that will only continue to increase, particularly as we're seeing a bit of a pop culture phenomenon around nuclear at the moment, especially in the US. But I think the main barriers at the moment is not necessarily these ideological arguments against nuclear, the safety, the waste. I think most people now understand, except that group who are, fully latched onto it, seen The Simpsons, can't move past that. But most, it's now these practicality questions in Australia. And I think
Timing, money.
money. I think there's obvious arguments why nuclear does stack up from time, money, even just energy demand. Our electricity demand set to double by 2050, thanks in large part to the AI data centres, electrification. If we want to be able to drive electric cars, then you need to get the electricity from somewhere. And I assume that most people would want to get it from clean energy sources. So nuclear has to be part of the discussion, because at the moment the government's set to miss their renewable target by as much as 17%. So I think that, it's obviously a more academic conversation which needs to occur, but I think we'll have to get there, because at the moment with how our energy system's going, it's almost inevitable that we need to explore other options. And I think top of that list should be nuclear power.
Let's address some of those fears that people do often raise. And one of them is the radiation fears. And I actually heard this stat at a conference of yours that I went to last year, and that eating one banana can equal or exceed a full year of radiation exposure from a nuclear power plant. And I think sitting there listening to that really shows that comparison of a real world object to go, okay, I eat a banana most days. They're in the fruit bowl. And that there is the equivalent of if I was right next to a nuclear power plant for a year. Yeah. How do we get those sort of messages out there? Because I really think that would appease a lot of people, that sort of a comparison to know that, actually, it's not that bad. I eat a banana all the time.
Well, lots of everyday things, whether it's, taking a flight, whether it's eating a banana, expose you to more radiation than you'd ever receive living around a nuclear power plant for an entire year. In fact, Australians are just naturally exposed to a background radiation of around 1.7 millisieverts each year. And that's significantly more radiation than what you get additionally from living near a nuclear power plant. It's everyday things. Even Parliament House, believe it or not, is more radioactive than a nuclear power plant. And that's because of all the granite which is inside that building. So there's all of these things that we need to be aware of, that, radiation is natural. It's all around us. It's not something to be afraid of. And certainly with a nuclear power plant, it's contained. A worker at a nuclear power plant receives less radiation in their job than a flight attendant would. You actually get a lot of radiation comparably. Sorry, I messed up that word. That'll be edited out. You get a lot more radiation from being a flight attendant than working in a nuclear power plant. So I think it's important to put all of these things in context. And when Australians hear of all of these examples, you hope that they become a bit more familiar with, what it's actually like to live near a nuclear plant. And there's so many examples of people living near nuclear power plants who really enjoy it. I was at 3 Mile Island last year. And obviously that's a very sensitive situation there. They've currently got one of their reactors, which is going to be turned back online through a deal with Microsoft to power their data centres. And I walked around the community, and it was really fascinating how informed they were, how supportive they were of the decision to turn the reactor back online, despite many of them, including some that I met, having lived through what happened at 3 Mile Island. So, it's really important to put all of these things, especially with radiation, in context.
And then the other fear, which I know you said before, it doesn't come up as much, but it did come up quite a lot during the campaign, and that is the nuclear waste.
We definitely see that on socials.
Yes. So just explain the process, because I know that France also has some element where they take some of our waste, do something with it, send it back. So can you just explain the process and where all these go, and also the big cement barrels of, I watched a video on YouTube where it was like trains were driving at it, and just show how secure and safe these, what do they call them? I'm
The
sitting here
nuclear
for
waste
anyone-
canisters.
The canisters, that's the word I was looking for. So just explain to everyone what the process is, but also how minimal the waste in reality is.
Can I just extend on that? I watched a documentary in America, I think it might have even been in Texas or something, where exactly what you're talking about, since 9/11, they actually build them to be like plane proof, like that not even a plane could crash into them. So in terms of safety, the regulations behind this are massive.
So I think we've been through the same YouTube rabbit holes, which is a good sign. And so basically there are multiple kinds of nuclear waste, and I'll start off with the ones that Australia manages. So they go in order of radioactivity and then in reverse order for the volume of waste which is produced. So low and intermediate level waste is everything from the aprons to the gloves that, say, the workers wear. And that is considered nuclear waste, radioactive waste. Now, Australia already manages this with Lucas Heights, with mining, with our nuclear medicine production, and we have facilities to manage it, whether it's at the Lucas Heights facility in Sydney. We've also got a near-surface geological repository in the middle of outback Western Australia, which has done fantastic work there to have that facility operational. So I guess the argument I'd make is on the high volume of waste, the greatest volume of nuclear waste is low intermediate level stuff. Australia's got that sorted out. We're actually world leading in that regard. Now it's the nuclear fuel assemblies, the nuclear fuel where people really freak out. That's, well, obviously it looks a bit different, but that's the stuff which is depicted as, the green goo in The Simpsons. So what actually happens to it? What these fuel assemblies, inside them is the nuclear fuel pellets with the uranium. They're inserted inside the reactor. It's where the fission process occurs, which creates the heat to spin the turbine to create the electricity. Now, after a certain amount of time, these need to be replaced inside the reactor. And there's a few options. So first of all, as a default, you have to move them into what's called spent fuel pools. And inside those pools, they rapidly cool down because water obviously cools, and also there's shielding that's protected, which basically means that, and I've done this before actually at Sizewell B in the United Kingdom, you can walk around these pools with, high level nuclear waste, the highly radioactive stuff, just a few meters down from you. Theoretically, you could swim in these pools, which are protecting the spent nuclear fuel, which is incredible. Now, during that time, it's typically a few years, the radiation falls dramatically. And then after that, you've got a few options. Mainly what they do is they then move these fuel assemblies into the spent fuel canisters, which are the big concrete reinforced canisters we were talking about. Now, again, the shielding is so intense, you can hug one of these, as I've done and many people have done. That's one option. That's more of a temporary option. The second thing you can do is put them in deep geological repositories, which is basically put them in canisters deep underground and seal it up. Now, you can obviously, at some point, they hope to be able to extract that fuel for later use, but that's what they're doing in Finland, and quite a few countries are going down that path. Australia is going to have to build one of these facilities for our nuclear submarines because the government said that we're going to be dealing with the spent nuclear fuel from the AUKUS submarines. The last option, which many people don't know about, is that these fuel assemblies can be recycled into more clean energy. And that's currently what France does. So France gets 10% of their energy from recycled nuclear fuel. They extract the useful components to then go back into their nuclear power plants. And funnily enough, this is proven technology that Australia already uses. The spent nuclear fuel from our Opal research reactor is sent over to France to be reprocessed. I guess, they're getting some clean energy out of it. And then we get sent back the byproducts, which are stored in canisters at Lucas Heights. So there's a range of different options for nuclear waste management. It is not this barrier that people talk about. It's, a political challenge, not a scientific one. It's stored safely around the world.
And just on the deep geological extraction, I remember reading about how that countries would be begging to be a country like us because we have got so much space to be able to do the deep geological burial of this nuclear waste. Is there something happening in WA? Is that where they're going to be putting some of the nuclear waste, or have they started building something, or have I completely read?
Potentially. So I think at the moment they're looking at defence land for siting this deep geological repository. there are some complexities which would have to be explored because you can't necessarily commingle civilian nuclear waste with defence waste. But certainly there could be discussions which could go on, because you could argue that, if defence is doing it, then obviously try and take advantage of that, and we've got our waste problem solved in Australia. There's been conversations in the past around Australia, and I wouldn't use this language because of the high standards being used for radioactive waste management. Some people would say we could be the radioactive waste dumping ground of the world, given our geology. That could be an interesting proposal, probably one that wouldn't get up in Australia. But there's obviously that option. In WA, there's a few things going on. That private company I mentioned is doing some tests of borehole technology and other things. That won't be for high-level radioactive waste, but they're really revolutionary what they're doing with TELUS. The last thing I'd say, though, is it's important to remember that not much nuclear fuel is needed to provide your power. If you were powered for your entire lifetime, the amount of nuclear fuel required could fit inside, frankly, one of these mugs, or inside a Coke can is the analogy many people would hear. Compare that to the number of solar panels, the amount of coal.
I was just about to say, is it 431 wind turbines to one nuclear power plant?
Exactly.
Mind-blowing.
It takes... So a gummy bear-sized nuclear fuel pellet, one of these pellets is inside the fuel assembly, produces as much energy as a ton of coal in a nuclear reactor, or 3 barrels of oil if we want a more timely example. So the energy density of nuclear power is really important because it means less mining, less waste is produced, and ultimately lower emissions and lower environmental impact than every energy source.
I also wanted to get your thoughts on thorium.
Yep.
On thorium reactors, because again, this also came up. I had two different people, and a lovely gentleman whose house I door knocked in Freshwater sent me quite a few articles about thorium reactors after we had discussed this at his doorstep. He sent that through LinkedIn. So it was very much appreciated, though, because it then did come up a few more times. And in particular, just because China is now building the first thorium reactor. What's your thoughts around going down the thorium path, more so as a way of appeasing people's fears, because nuclear seems to have negative connotations and thorium doesn't seem to have that same response when you mention it?
Generally, my opinion is that Australia should be technology agnostic to whether it's large reactors, small modular reactors, micro reactors, the ones in the shipping containers. We should be looking at all of those technologies. But in particular for a country like Australia, I think our preference should be towards the proven technologies which are being deployed around the world, which is light water reactors, not thorium reactors. And the reason for that is, we obviously have these huge cost and time questions in Australia. There is an element to, the thorium debate, obviously, that it is unproven. Certainly in the West, we don't have large thorium reactors in the West currently, which are proven and deployable in Australia. So I obviously have no issues with thorium power plants. I would love to have them in Australia. Similarly, I'd love to have fusion in Australia, but I think from a practicality question, it makes most sense for Australia at this moment to be deploying proven reactor designs in this country, the same which are obviously going to have to be used, similar that will have to be used on the nuclear submarines we're getting. But thorium's very exciting. There's so many advanced nuclear technologies which are non-light water reactor based, which are exciting, but I just think we have to be realistic what we can accommodate in Australia. We probably shouldn't be a first mover. Because we're not going to be able to build as many nuclear plants as other countries will be able to. We should wait until they're proven and then deploy them.
I'm ready to move on to some rapid fire questions. If you've
more.
got some more, I'll let Jamie keep going.
When you go out and look at other nuclear reactors around the globe, what is the funding model like? Because that was obviously a really big issue with the coalition's plan, that it was going to be a taxpayer funded, and that was how Labor were able to really go hard to be like, it's $600 billion of your money. Is it normally the outside market reacts to the price and then you get other people to build it. Is that the way that other countries or
is it taxpayer funded? Yeah.
Typically, it's a combination. Most countries, such as the United States, have a model where they invite private investment from the utilities, but they also have government loans. So at the moment, they've got the United States energy. Oh, it's a new term. I think it's the Energy Dominance Fund or group, which provides loan options to nuclear plants. The reason why typically government has to be involved, there's a separate regulatory piece, obviously the government has to be involved there, is because a nuclear power plant is such a long-term energy asset, which obviously lasts up to 100 years. Getting that, there's a risk associated with that, getting the return on investment over that long period of time, where it might not have as much interest from the private sector, but government can help back it in and give those guarantees. The interesting thing, though, is that we're seeing a lot more interest from the private sector, particularly because of small modular reactors, because the other barrier is often the large reactors. They are huge infrastructure projects with a huge capital cost. So it makes it difficult because there's not many private players who can actually go in and fund them. But with small modular reactors, because the cost is lower, we're seeing more private companies step up. 14 of the world's biggest banks and funds recently committed to support the effort globally to triple global nuclear capacity, which is a big deal, including Goldman Sachs, Barclays, a lot of the big financial institutions everyone would be aware of. And the other really exciting thing at the moment is the big tech companies in the US are starting to invest in nuclear. Recently, Meta, which runs Facebook and Instagram, announced a deal which included 8 small modular reactors from Bill Gates backed TerraPower, which is super exciting. Similarly, Google have made investments, Amazon, Oracle, OpenAI. So there's a lot of investment going on at the moment, particularly in these advanced small modular reactors, micro reactors. I think if we lifted the ban in Australia, that there'd be a similar appetite here. But at the moment, the ban is the roadblock.
Yeah, the debate can't even happen. That's so frustrating.
We're going to miss this whole AI boom because there was an article just recently where Tim Ayres has told these companies that if you're going to build a data center here, you then need to build all the renewable energy to be able to power these. And I thought, you're making people go, well, I'm not going to touch Australia. Why would you go and open up a data AI center and have to rely on renewables that you have to also pay for? It just blows my mind that we won't even entertain the discussion of nuclear when everyone else is going in that direction, and we're going to miss out on a huge employment opportunity, economy, so many things because we're just
literally
so
mind-blowing
on nuclear. It blows my mind.
100%. I think it's really concerning, particularly the government's 84% renewable target or 82, whatever it is, it's in the 80s range, is 17% off track. So there's this, people I think really underestimate the challenge it's going to be, this energy transition. You know, we're not only having to solve and replace the current grid, but we're having to replace then as well this new grid, this expanded grid, which is potentially going to double in demand by 2050. And how are we going to do that? By limiting our options. We should have every single option on the table, including nuclear power. And it's stabbing ourselves in the foot. It's ridiculous to not be having nuclear power in the mix, particularly with these challenges we're seeing with data centres, even electrification. Many of the politicians talk about electrification, wanting the electric cars, wanting us to transition everything in our homes to fully electricity. Now, if we can't even meet current demands, if we're not even going to meet the renewable targets the government sets, how is that all going to happen? How are we going to have that broader decarbonisation? How are we going to, power the manufacturers that are shutting down in this country?
This is where I just see such hypocrisy as well, because the same very people, I know that this, for you, this is not a left or a right political debate, but for us, from a political standpoint, I find the hypocrisy mind-blowing that those on the left are pushing for the digitalisation, they're pushing for the electric cars, they're pushing for mass immigration, so it's booming our population, they're pushing for all the reasons to increase the demand of energy, but then they're not willing to have the argument on the other side for how we provide that reliable demand in an affordable fashion for this country.
Progressive politics should be the loudest proponent of nuclear power in this country. I just think it's, a shame. We need to get past the partisanisation of it in this country, but I think we'll get there at some point.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is Jamie's.
All right,
favourite
this
part
is
of
always my favourite part.
Favourite part.
All right, sorry, whether or not you can do this in one sentence. How would you describe the state of Australia's energy system in one sentence?
Bleak. I do not look forward to the day where I have to pay my first power bill.
Oh, the young ones have spoken. Now, if Australia were to stay on this path, where do you see us in 10 years?
Very similar, bleak. I think industry will continue to move out. We'll have power challenges. We'll miss out on some of these exciting opportunities we're seeing in this country.
Now, one thing we didn't touch on in as much detail as I thought we would is the fact that Australia sits on more than a third of the world's uranium. And of course, it's uranium that is needed to create nuclear energy. With that in mind, would nuclear energy be cheaper and more sustainable for Australians than it is other nations?
I think that it would deliver an affordable energy mix in Australia, and it would help bring down our emissions.
All right. And with what other countries are doing, we've just seen that, I think if we add the 30 already using it and the 50 signing up, we're talking around 80 countries around the world exploring this nuclear energy. Are they gaining a competitive advantage over us, not only now, but in the long run?
Definitely, even just with the data centre question, they're able to provide the power that they need. Australia will not be able to.
And last one. If you were designing Australia's energy system from scratch, what would it look like?
Well, frankly, it probably look like 100% nuclear, but we have to be realistic. So it would have a good share of nuclear in the mix, and it would have already been built. Wouldn't have to be having this discussion at this stage, but we're here where we are, need to lift the ban.
Absolutely.
Well, Will, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the JJ Podcast.